What if the key to winning a desperate battle wasn't to stand and fight, but to run? In the freezing winter of 1781, one American general turned his army's biggest weakness into its most devastating weapon. He looked at his unreliable, frightened militia, men famous for breaking and fleeing at the first glint of a British bayonet. And instead of scolding them, he gave them permission to do what they did best. He ordered them to run. This is the story of the feigned retreat at the Battle of Cowpens. It was a perfect trap that shattered an elite British force and orchestrated one of the most brilliant tactical victories in military history. It was a battle that shouldn't have been won, fought on ground no sane general would have chosen, and it would become a crucial turning point in the American Revolution. This is the story of two commanders on a collision course. One, a rough-hewn backcountry brawler who commanded through sheer grit and respect. The other, a young, handsome, and utterly ruthless aristocrat who believed he was invincible. Their clash in a South Carolina cow pasture wouldn't just decide their own fates, it would help seal the fate of a continent. By the winter of 1780, the American Revolution was on the brink of collapse in the South. The British had launched their Southern strategy, convinced that the Southern colonies were filled with loyalists just waiting to flock to the King's banner. They had already captured Savannah, then Charleston, and at the Battle of Camden, they had delivered a crushing blow that shattered the main American Southern Army. The cause for independence looked bleak. Into this mess came two of the war's most compelling figures, destined for a showdown. On one side was Lieutenant Colonel Benastry Tarleton. At just 26 years old, Tarleton was the embodiment of the British war machine, handsome, daring, and brutally effective. Born to a wealthy Liverpool family, he ditched a law career for the army after his taste for gambling and high society drained his funds. In America, he quickly made a name for himself, commanding the British Legion, a fearsome unit of loyalist Americans in distinctive green jackets. Tarleton was fast and relentless, but he was also feared for his cruelty. After the Battle of Waxhaws, his troops were accused of slaughtering American soldiers who were trying to surrender. The event became known as the Waxhaws Massacre, and the phrase "Tarleton's Quarter" became a bitter American joke for "take no prisoners." Nicknamed Bloody Ban by the Patriots, Tarleton had a string of victories and an unshakable belief in his own superiority. On the other side was a man who couldn't have been more different. Brigadier General Daniel Morgan was a giant of a man, a product of the wild American frontier. While Tarleton was born to privilege, Morgan was born into hardship, leaving home as a teen after a fight with his father. He made his way in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley as a teamster, hauling goods across the rugged landscape. It was during the French and Indian War, while serving as a wagoner for the British Army, that he earned the nickname the Old Wagoner and a deep-seated hatred for the British establishment. After a British officer insulted him, Morgan knocked the man down, an offense that got him sentenced to 500 lashes. It was a punishment that should have killed him, but he miraculously survived, and the scars on his back became a permanent reminder of the Crown's arrogance. Morgan wasn't a textbook general. He was hard-living, quick to a fight, and more comfortable in a tavern than a fancy drawing room. But he was a natural leader. He understood the frontiersmen and militia he commanded because he was one of them. He spoke their language, knew their fears, and knew how to get them to fight. He had famously led his riflemen on a grueling 600-mile march in just 21 days to join the siege of Boston, and his sharpshooters had been critical at the Battle of Saratoga. Now, as a brigadier general, he was sent south to rally the shattered American resistance. The stage was set, the cold, calculating butcher versus the tough, canny old wagoner. The new American commander in the South, Nathaniel Greene, was a genius in his own right. Arriving in December 1780 to find a broken army, he made a decision that defied all military logic. Facing Cornwallis's vastly superior force, any sane general would have kept his small army together. Instead, Greene split it. He would lead one part, while sending Daniel Morgan with a smaller force of about 1,000 men into the South Carolina backcountry. Morgan's mission was to threaten the key British outpost at 96 and reignite the rebellion in the countryside. This move put Lord Cornwallis, the overall British commander, in an impossible position. If he chased Greene, Morgan could wreak havoc behind him. If he went after Morgan, he'd leave the path to his main supply base wide open. So Cornwallis, a gambler himself, also split his army. He would march north after Greene, while sending the one man he believed could catch and destroy Morgan, Banastre Tarleton. Cornwallis gave Tarleton a powerful force of over 1,100 men, including his British Legion, regular infantry, and 2 light cannons called grasshoppers. His orders were simple: find Morgan and crush him. For Tarleton, this was more than a mission. It was a hunt. He despised the American militia and their unconventional commanders, and he couldn't wait to finally destroy the old wagoner. What followed was a desperate, freezing chase across the Carolinas. True to his reputation, Tarleton pushed his men without mercy, driving them through mud and ice and fording swollen rivers. He was closing in fast. On January 16th, Morgan found himself with his back against the broad river, which was flooded and impossible to cross. Tarleton was just hours behind him. Morgan's men were exhausted, and the militia were terrified. Retreat was no longer an option. He had to turn and fight. He decided to make his stand at a place called Hannah's Cowpens, a wide-open pasture used for grazing cattle. To his officers, the choice of ground looked like strategic suicide. An open field offered no protection for their flanks, and the raging river at their back cut off any real hope of retreat. When an officer asked where they would retreat to, Morgan grimly pointed to the river and said, "We will have to pass it in the night as a victorious army, or be driven into it as a defeated one." He was deliberately choosing a battlefield that told his men there was no escape. They would either win or they would die. That night, as more militia trickled into camp, Morgan didn't rest. He walked among the campfires, speaking to his men not as a general, but as one of them. Daniel Morgan's genius didn't come from military textbooks. He'd never read them. It came from a deep, intuitive understanding of his men and his enemy. He knew his militia weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers and frontiersmen, terrified of a disciplined British bayonet charge. He knew at the disaster at Camden, the militia had fled at the first sign of contact, dooming the army. Other generals saw this as a fatal flaw. Morgan saw it as a predictable behavior he could use. Walking through the camp that night, he was brutally honest. He wasn't going to ask them to stand and die like regulars. Instead, he made them a simple, clear promise. "Just give me 2 shots," he told them, holding up 2 fingers. "2 volleys, and you can run." He told them to aim for the officers, the men with the shiny swords and decorations, to sow chaos in the British ranks. After 2 rounds, they were to fall back behind the main line and regroup. He wasn't just giving them permission to do what their instincts were screaming at them to do. He was making their retreat part of the plan. He was turning their greatest weakness into his greatest strength. His plan was a defense in depth, organized into 3 lines. A masterpiece of tactical psychology designed to counter Tarleton's famous aggression. The first line was made up of about 150 of his best sharpshooters, mainly crack-shot frontiersmen. Positioned as skirmishers, their job was to hide behind trees, disrupt the British advance, and most importantly, pick off the officers. After firing, they were to fall back 150 yards to the second line. The second line was about 300 militia under the command of the reliable Colonel Andrew Pickens. This was the line Morgan had made his famous promise to. They would absorb the initial shock, fire their 2 volleys, and then execute the planned retreat. This was the bait. Morgan was counting on Tarleton's arrogance, knowing that when he saw the militia break, he would assume it was another American rout and order a reckless, all-out charge. The third and final line was the anchor of the plan, positioned on a hill crest. Here, Morgan placed his best troops, roughly 450 veteran Continental soldiers from Maryland and Delaware. These were the professionals, men who wouldn't break. Their job was to wait, holding their fire until the British, exhausted and disorganized from chasing the militia, were right on top of them. But there was one final hidden piece to Morgan's trap. Out of sight behind the hill, he concealed his cavalry, about 80 dragoons led by Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, a cousin of George Washington. They were the hammer, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The plan was incredibly risky. A feigned retreat is one of the hardest maneuvers in warfare. It can easily turn into a real, panicked rout. But Morgan trusted his men. As the cold dawn broke on January 17, 1781, his small army stood waiting. They could hear Tarleton's troops approaching. The trap was set. At 3 a.m., hearing of Morgan's location, Banastre Tarleton had roused his exhausted troops for one last punishing march. They had been moving for hours in the dark, cold, and wet. When they finally reached Copens around dawn, they were hungry and sleep-deprived. But Tarleton, seeing the American force out in the open, believed he had them cornered. Supremely confident, he didn't pause to rest his men or properly scout the American position. He saw exactly what Morgan wanted him to see: an amateur army, poorly positioned with a river at its back, ripe for destruction. He ordered an immediate head-on attack. The battle began exactly as Morgan had planned. As the British line advanced, their red coats made stark targets. Morgan's first line of sharpshooters opened fire from behind trees, picking off officers and causing confusion before the main lines even met. Then they coolly fell back to the second line. Seeing the skirmishers withdraw, Tarleton's men cheered and surged forward, right into the teeth of the militia. The 300 militiamen held their ground, waited until the British were just yards away, and fired their first volley, tearing into the British ranks. They reloaded, fired a second time, and then, having given the 2 shots they promised, they turned and ran. To Tarleton, this was it. The cowardly militia were breaking, just as they always did. He smelled victory. He unleashed his dragoons to ride down the fleeing Americans and ordered his infantry to charge with bayonets. But as his dragoons charged, they were met by William Washington's cavalry, who countercharged from behind the hill, driving them back in disarray. Meanwhile, Tarleton's infantry, now a disorganized mass, continued their triumphant pursuit up the hill. As they cleared the crest, they were met with a terrifying sight. Morgan's third line, the stone-faced Continental regulars, standing in perfect formation with muskets leveled. The Continentals held their fire until the exhausted British were nearly on top of them, then unleashed a single devastating volley. The front ranks of the British assault disintegrated. In the chaos, a mistaken order caused the American right flank to start an orderly withdrawal. Seeing this, the rest of the Continentals began to fall back to maintain the line. To Tarleton, it looked like even the regulars were breaking. He ordered his last reserves, the elite 71st Highlanders, to charge and flank them. But this was no panicked retreat. Morgan rode to the front, roaring, "Face about, boys! Give them one good fire, and the victory is ours!" As the Highlanders rushed forward to the sound of bagpipes, the entire Continental line suddenly halted. turned as one and fired another thunderous volley from less than 30 yards away. The shock was absolute. At that exact moment, the trap snapped shut. The militia, who had looped around the battlefield, reappeared and slammed into the British left flank. At the same time, Washington's cavalry crashed into the British right flank. The British force was caught in a classic double envelopment, the only one of its kind in the Revolutionary War. Fired on from three sides, the disciplined Red Line dissolved into a terrified mob. Surrounded, shocked, and with their officers down, organized resistance collapsed. Men threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. The entire elite British force was utterly broken. The collapse was swift and total. Within minutes, an elite fighting force was reduced to pockets of panicked men. The battle, which lasted less than an hour, turned into a rout. Patriots, remembering the Waxhaws massacre, were heard crying, "Tarleton's quarter," as they closed in. A grim promise of the same mercy Tarleton had shown them. The Master Tarleton watched in disbelief as his invincible legion was annihilated. Refusing to accept defeat, he gathered a small group of about 50 officers and horsemen for a final stand. He was then confronted by William Washington, who had charged ahead of his men. A personal duel broke out. As Washington raised his sword to strike, Tarleton fired his pistol, wounding Washington's horse, before turning and fleeing the field. With his remaining dragoons, Tarleton galloped away, abandoning his army, his artillery, and his reputation. He finally reached the safety of Lord Cornwallis's lines to deliver the shocking news of his own defeat. The aftermath at Copens was staggering. The American victory wasn't just decisive, it was almost total. Of Tarleton's force of over 2,100 men, the British suffered catastrophic losses. Over 110 were killed, more than 200 were wounded, and a staggering 712 were captured. Tarleton had lost nearly 86% of his command. In stark contrast, American casualties were incredibly light, with as few as 25 killed and around 124 wounded. Daniel Morgan, the old wagoner, hadn't just defeated Tarleton, he had humiliated him and effectively erased his powerful mobile force from the war. He had orchestrated a tactical masterpiece that sent a shockwave through the southern colonies. The seemingly invincible British army was not only beatable, it could be shattered. The Battle of Copens was far more than a brilliant victory. It was a profound turning point in the war. Patriot morale, which had been at rock bottom, soared. The news of Morgan's triumph spirited up the people, proving that American militia, when led properly, could defeat the best of the British regulars. Strategically, the consequences for Lord Cornwallis were devastating. In a single hour, he lost nearly a quarter of his southern army and his elite light troops, the very force he relied on for scouting and protecting his flanks. Crippled and vengeful, Cornwallis abandoned his strategy of pacifying South Carolina and became obsessed with chasing the American armies. This grueling pursuit wore down his army and eventually led him to Guilford Courthouse, and then, finally, to a coastal town in Virginia to rest his exhausted army. That town was Yorktown. The fake retreat at Cowpens, born from the mind of a general who knew how to turn weakness into strength, set in motion the chain of events that led directly to the final British surrender. It was a perfect trap, a tactical masterpiece that not only broke an army but also broke the back of the British Southern strategy, paving the way for American independence. If you enjoyed this look at one of history's most brilliant battles, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next story. And let us know in the comments what other historical turning points you'd like us to cover. Thanks for watching.